Hi, I'm Zach Lovett, and this is the advanced tutorial for Flex, a new script by myself and Vincent Rainery. Flex is all about creating flexible layouts for your layers. Now, this is the longer, more advanced tutorial. If you're just looking for a quick overview on what Flex is and how to use it, check out the basic tutorial. Thus said, this video assumes you've seen the basic tutorial, and so we're going to skip all that stuff and instead cover things like the flex method, matte mode, and some of these other line utilities and grid utilities. The first thing we're going to look at are the flex methods. Now, what this is in the interface is this little flex method category and these dropdowns. What these control is the way that your flex layers will scale to fit their container. So for grid, that's how does this layer fit the row or column or both that it's in? For line, it's how does it fit the comp or container dimensions? Now in the interface, you can see that these settings have a little star beside the one that we sort of recommend for that flex rig. For line, best is usually good. And for grid, stretch is the default option. So let's take a look at what these actually look like. Here I've set up this comp with a simple little layer and a grid rig, just to demonstrate the difference between them all. To change these, you go into your flex layer, into the flex effect, and look at this flex dropdown. So by default, it's stretch. And if I play through this comp, you can see that our layer is stretching. The scale of the layer is always going to be whatever it needs to be to fully fill this row and column that it's in, even if it means scaling disproportionately. The opposite of this would be none, that is, don't scale at all. So as we play, we can see our column and rows are moving. In fact, we can move these ourselves, and it's going to reposition to be inside the flex rig, but it's not going to scale at all. The next one is fit width. And what this will do is make sure that your layer always fits the width of the container it's in. So in the grid, it's always going to fit the columns, and it doesn't really care about the row. And as we move these, it's always going to fit. Fit height is the same thing, but for height instead of width. So as we play, it's always going to scale into the height, but it's going to scale proportionately. Next is fit best. And this one's a little cleverer. As we play through, you're seeing that it's always going to scale to either the height or the width, whichever keeps it within the area it's supposed to be. So here, we don't ever want our layer to go outside of the bounds, and so best is going to keep it there and scale it proportionately. Fill is sort of the opposite. Fill will always take the bigger of the two, to make sure that you're always filling the shape and you don't get any extra transparent space. So fill is always going to fill in this inner shape, even if it means going outside of the bounds, versus fit best gives you all this transparent area at the top and bottom, which you probably don't want. And then we're back to stretch, which as you can see, fills the shape fully, but our art's kind of weird and ugly. You usually don't want to use stretch for any pre-comps or footage or any artwork that you care about. Now I just want to point out that if we have, let's say fill or fit height or fit width, some of these modes go outside of the bounds. And the problem is that if we have a whole grid of layers, like a whole bunch of layers here, they're all going to overlap each other. So what we need is a way to constrain our artwork to only be inside of this little container that it should be in. And this is where matte mode comes in. So in this scene, it's nearly identical. The only difference is we now have this matte shape layer. Now to generate a matte shape layer, when you rig up your rows or columns or your lines, you just have to make sure this checkbox is enabled. I want to note that some things like the flex method and the line direction, you can always just go into your layers and change these settings. You can change the flex mode or whatever you need to. But mattes, you cannot toggle on and off after the fact. It needs to be on or off when you rig the row in order to actually create those mattes. So with no stretching, you can see what's happening. We are keeping the position always centered in the row and column, but we're matting it to only appear within that shape. If we change the flex mode to fit width, well, we're not really going to see anything on the sides, but the top and bottom are going to be cut off. Fit height, same idea. Now the sides are cut off because we're fitting to the height of the cell. Fit best, you're not going to see the matte effect at all. Fill, you're going to see it wherever it needs to be cut off to make sure we're always filling the space. And stretch again, well, we're not going to see the matte because it's already filling the entire space. The idea here is that you can combine different flex methods and matte modes to get some really cool results. Here's a few that we prepped just to kind of show the strengths of these features. Moving on, let's look at a few specific extra things in line and grid. To start, I have a grid scene here in which I've matted out each of our layers and I've arranged them horizontally. So if we move one layer, you can see the others are shifting. But you can note that the shifting is a little weird. Well, the problem with fitting is that it should really be bigger, but the scaling flex mode isn't letting it get bigger. Well, okay, we've seen this. We can go to flex mode and say fill, and now it's bigger. But we also want to fill this one. I mean, it'll sell you with the matte, but let's say we want to fill this one too. Well, okay, I think you can kind of see that it's going to be annoying to go into every single layer and change the flex modes one by one. So a shortcut is to select your layers, come into the flex method, and just choose them all here. Fit height, fit width, fill, stretch, which is a little funny, none. By selecting your layers and changing this dropdown, you can just go ahead and change all of them at once. Furthermore, I've got this rig and, maybe it's animated and I've got some really cool art, but I realize I forgot a shape. I don't have my little blue circle in here. Well, what we can do is hold Shift and click Rig Line. You can see the little tooltip tells you, if you Shift click, it's going to add this layer into the existing rig, which is sort of just a handy way to augment or keep working your rigs after the fact. And because matte mode's enabled, it has also made a matte for that layer. So here, it'll behave just as you'd expect, just a quick way to add new layers to an existing rig. Moving on from there, let's look at the utilities section. At this point, flex lines only have one utility, called recalculate size or update size. Well, the idea here is that when you rig a layer into a line rig, it's going to figure out some of the information about the layer. Like it knows that this is a circle and the circle's basic size is a certain amount across. Well, shape layers are dynamic and they don't have to be ellipses. So if we came in here and instead made it, a polystar, and brought the fill over. Okay, so now it's a star shape. That's actually a bad example because it's the same size. Let me just make this a little funnier. Okay, so I've changed the contents of the layer, but Flex doesn't know that I've made it smaller. It's not looking at the size live, it's kind of a snapshot when we rig it up. That's what this button is for. Clicking this will get Flex to re-figure out how big our layer is and then readjust our rig accordingly just so it fits. From here, we can keep animating, keep flexing, and go on our merry way. Let's take a look at grid rigs now. In this situation, I've created a row for these two layers, and I have two separate columns. So if I move the middle controller, we can see the divider here. If I move these, we're going to move those two. But the pink layer isn't doing anything. It's kind of just free floating, it's unrigged, it just exists. Well, when we add this to a row or a column, Flex will actually try to detect the nearest handles and fit it into that shape. So here, when I hit rig column, I don't want Flex to make some new shape layers because I already have these. So let's try that. We hit rig column and nothing's changed in the comp, but this layer is now rigged. Flex has gone and found the nearest columns to the boundaries and told it to use those. Of course, I didn't tell it to make a row, so it's not going to use this one, but from here we can hit rig row, and it'll only make a bottom controller. The top controller already existed, so it doesn't need to make it. So this is sort of auto detection step going on here, where we try to figure out where we should be. Okay, so let's look at it in the context of this layer. If I rig row here, I know what I want. What I want to happen is to make a new ruler at the very bottom and use the one at the top so that it fits the space. But if I hit rig row, it's detecting this very bottom one, which maybe sometimes you want that. You want to span to the top and bottom. But in this case, I don't. What you can do is have your layer selected and hold Shift to click rig row or column. And it's going to say in the tooltip there, hold Shift to create a new row for your layer. So I'm going to do this. And now it's made this bottom control, but it's also made a new top control. Okay, so they're on top of each other, but what it means is that I can move the row that this yellow layer is in independently of this row that controls these two. So even though they're overlapping, they are separate rows. And okay, maybe you don't want that, you just want the new bottom one, and the top one's kind of annoying. There's a few options there. One is to take that new layer that's created and delete it, and then tell this row, you could either hit rig row again and it'll find it, or you can go into your grid boundaries and set the top to that row 1 to snap to that existing row bounds. Now, okay, so that was a few steps. We had to make this controller, which automatically placed it here, but I'm just going to undo all of that because that felt a little frustrating. This is where these utilities come in. What these utilities will do is first, this will add a grid controller to a layer. Okay, so let's say we have our yellow layer here. I'm going to hit add controller, and all it's done is given me my flex grid layer settings, which on its own isn't the most exciting. But it means that Flex isn't going to do any of that smart logic of detecting stuff. It's letting you choose where your boundaries are. So here I can say my top layer should be row 1. The bottom layer, which snaps to the comp end, should be row 2. Maybe left is column 1 and right is column 3. Well, it's actually behind these two cells, but we've just gone and manually rigged our yellow layer to be within those bounds. Okay, so that's neat for manually setting the layers, but these two buttons, all they'll do is extra helpers here. You click one of these rulers and all it does is make a shape layer. Now, again, these rulers aren't doing anything smart on their own. They're just helpers for you to use with Flex so that you can make them be wherever you need to so that your layers follow your own manual grid. So if you really didn't want to use any of the smart detection logic in these buttons, you can create your own Flex grid that works perfectly exactly the same way manually with these buttons here. And so now we have a completely independent Flex grid working in the same comp as our existing one. And that's how you'd manually set up your own grid rig. The third tab in Flex is the Creator. Now, this is really straightforward. The idea is just to give you some quick little tools to make your life a little easier. Each of these buttons is going to make a shape. So if we click square, it's going to ask us, well, how big of a square do you want? 100 by 100, we've got it. Maybe a circle, maybe a star. Again, really straightforward. If you wanted to bypass that menu, there's a shortcut you can hold to skip asking for the size, but really that's the job it does. These two buttons here will create a text layer or pre-comp any layers you have. Again, they're just little helpers. Maybe the coolest part though is this stroke section. What this will do is take a layer with a stroke and try to offset the stroke using a little bit of expression shape layer magic. So by default, the stroke is on both sides of our path. That's this button. This one will rig it with an inner stroke. So here you can see the stroke is now inside the shape. This one, it's outside the shape. And so these are, again, just little helpers to maybe quickly change up your shape art if that's what you're working with. So that was the advanced flex tutorial. We went through the different flex methods, flex matte mode, how to add layers to your rigs, and the different utilities they provide. We also took a quick look at the Creator tab. Thanks for watching and enjoy!